Hey, hello, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and series and podcast. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Jonathan Schanzer, Senior Vice President for Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and author, join us to discuss his latest book coming out November 3rd, Gaza Conflict 2021, Hamas, Israel, and 11 Days of War. Dr. Schanzer will speak for 15 minutes, then open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Dr. Jonathan Schanzer.
Thank you very much, Stacey. Thank you all for joining today. It's my pleasure to speak about a new book that I've written. It was certainly a challenging undertaking. I decided to write the book within a few days of the close of the conflict earlier this spring. I actually wrote the first draft of the book in about 8 days. From there, traveled to Israel, was there for 10 days just before the Delta variant really began to spook the Israelis. So I had good access. I was able to talk to a number of senior officials, and then from there came home and spent a good couple of months editing the book. And now I'm pleased to say that it is the first one on the market. The goal is to correct a lot of the really poor narratives that I think were shared here in the West during those 11 days of conflict. We'll say that this was by far the war that Israel has fought that I was able to track the closest, not because of a more intense interest, but because of the technology that's now available, the smartphone, smart TV technology, the real-time Twitter feeds of a number of excellent reporters, and the ability just to be in touch with people more regularly via WhatsApp or Signal or simply text messaging or email. It was really remarkable for me. So the end result is that I tracked this conflict very closely. I found a number of things that were just very wrong with the coverage, and that's what drove me to write the book. And what I thought I would do today is to share a couple of moments from the conflict itself. Not to go over day by day or hour by hour, but to really highlight a few, just a handful of issues that I thought really went unexplored or poorly explored during the war. And then from there to open it up to your questions, where I'm very happy to talk about anything that may be on your mind with regard to what happened then and what's happening now. So I'll begin today with May 10th of this year, 2021. War just broke out, and Gaza-based fighters are firing rockets at Jerusalem, some 50 miles away from the Gaza Strip. Reporters here in America all pointed very oddly to a real estate dispute in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of Jerusalem. Israel, as it was reported, was about to evict some local Arab residents, and this was the reason for the violence, and this was widely reported. So first, let me begin by saying that real estate disputes do not cause violence. Weapons cause violence. So rockets, missiles, mortars, bullets, these are the things that launch a war, not a looming real estate dispute that is being settled in a judicial setting. It's also probably worth noting that the court case in question had been dragging on for decades. It dated back to the beginning of the last century. And the idea that somehow that the fact that this case was possibly coming to a head and that was the reason for war, I felt was incredibly irresponsible. Second, I would just note that there was something that happened just before the war, and I actually remember speaking about it to this very audience through the Middle East Forum at the time, and that was the question of canceled elections. The Palestinians were planning on holding elections that would include Hamas. This would have been a disastrous undertaking. Hamas was sure to win seats. The fact that it was about to win seats was likely going to lead to a cutoff in American assistance or recognition of the Palestinian Authority. And after some hemming and hawing, the Biden administration decided to back down from supporting Hamas's inclusion. But in the process, once the Palestinian Authority did remove Hamas from the equation and cancel these elections, Hamas was furious. Hamas was looking to try to regain the upper hand and to demonstrate that it still was a leading faction among the Palestinian people. And it was for that reason, in my estimation, and I think really many people view it this way at this point in retrospect, that Hamas launched this war as a means to try to capture hearts and minds of the Palestinian people by other means. The war against Israel, at least among certain circles, the kind of irredentist and Islamist portion of the Palestinian public, which is significant, they appreciate it when Hamas engages in what it describes as resistance activity against Israel. And that was really, I think, the missing piece for understanding why Hamas launched this war when it did. Of course, people will point to the fact that Jerusalem Day took place right before the conflict broke out, or that it was Ramadan. Again, these things, I think, really don't point to motivations. They might have contributed in some shape or form, but at the end of the day, I do believe that Hamas was looking to regain the upper hand after being knocked out of the box in the lead up to the elections, leading up to those canceled elections. And then the other thing that I think is probably worth noting here is the war between wars, as the Israelis call it. This is an ongoing campaign that the Israelis have been waging against Iran and its proxies. This is Israel taking out weapons that are transiting across Syria bound for Lebanon. It's Israel taking out Iranian nuclear actors, and that could be scientists, it could be people involved in the nuclear program itself, and a number of other daring operations, cyber, naval, or otherwise, that have done grave damage to the Islamic Republic over the last several months, and in fact, several years. Now, the Hamas, of course, is a proxy of the Islamic Republic, and Iran, just in the weeks leading up to the conflict, was warning Israel that it was going to pay a price for what it had been doing against the Islamic Republic. And you had a number of senior Iranian officials effectively call for Iran and its proxies to wage war against Israel. This was, again, not noted in our media, and it was as if Iran did not have a significant role to play in the financing, training, and arming of Hamas over the last 3-4 decades. Really remarkable that that was not included in the analysis, because of course Iran is responsible for the vast majority of the rockets fired. Now, I would just say that, perhaps the last thing to note is that there was also no mention of the fact that Hamas had clearly prepared well in advance of this conflict. The largest numbers of simultaneous salvos ever recorded in the 4 wars that Hamas has fought against Israel over the years. It was very clear that they were very well prepared for this moment. It was not spontaneous. Now, this single point of failure narrative, we see it a lot. I recall in 2000, Ariel Sharon being blamed for the outbreak of the Second Intifada for walking on the Temple Mount. Even back in 1929, Jews were blamed for an outbreak of violence against Jews for asserting their right to pray in the Temple Mount compound. So the lesson here, I think, is, for all of us to take away, is that rarely, if ever, is there a single thing that prompts these conflicts. There is always a low flame. Yes, things can contribute to it, but more often than not, these are organized bouts of violence, and it is nearly almost always the case that the Palestinians have organized these in advance. This is Palestinian aggression at the end of the day, and they look for excuses to launch these wars. The second day of the conflict is, I think, another important moment. And this was something that did not get a lot of attention at the time. And that was that fireballs were reaching high in the air in Ashkelon, the southern town just on the other side, the northern side of the Gaza border. For me, I was watching on TV. The video was jarring. Israelis were watching this video in horror for hours as fire continued to basically reach higher and higher into the air. And my immediate thought at the time was that it was probably a drone or even a precision-guided munition. But as it turns out, based on conversations that I had upon going to Israel right after the conflict, it was a lucky strike. It was a mortar. It was not even a rocket that was able to hit a large gas container that was connected to the Ashkelon pipeline. Now, Iron Dome is able to stop rockets, but mortars are typically not stopped by Iron Dome. And mortars can fly up to 8 kilometers. This one flew, according to my interlocutors, maybe 6 kilometers, possibly even less than that. And the result was one of the more devastating attacks in recent memory. I can't remember Israel taking a direct hit in this way with the kind of explosion that resulted afterwards. I believe that Israel still has a gag order on this incident. That's at least from what I can discern. No one is talking to me about it. But that does, I think, lead me to lesson number 2 for today's discussion. And that is that Hamas is able to cause a great amount of destruction. Israel's defenses make that less likely. Iron Dome in particular has done a tremendous job in minimizing the damage that Hamas seeks to cause. But these rockets are not harmless. They're not firecrackers, as a lot of Hamas apologists will call them. They are deadly weapons. The media often likes to point to the disparity in casualties as proof that Israel is the aggressor. But what they ignore consistently is Hamas's intent. Hamas inspires to mass casualty attacks. In fact, they aspire to war crimes. And for whatever reason, this is not noted most of the time in the media coverage after now 4 rounds of conflict. Now, moving ahead to May 13th, this I think was probably the most famous point in the war. This is when the IDF tweeted in both Hebrew and English that it had put assets on the ground in the Gaza Strip. From all indications, Israel had just invaded Gaza. The Wall Street Journal, AFP, and other major news outlets ran the story. But in Israel, reporters did not. I was watching Israeli TV, and there was great confusion. There were reporters who were literally standing on the border with Gaza, and they could not corroborate what was coming out of the American press. As it turns out, Hamas was likely the intended audience. The terrorist group flooded its so-called metro system of underground tunnels in response to the news. And their goal in putting these commandos in the tunnels was to be able to kidnap or kill as many Israelis as possible. Israel, as it turns out, was ready for them. On some level, this appeared to be an information operation. Israel took the opportunity. Once the commandos filled the tunnels, they started bombing the tunnels. They killed dozens of Iranian trained fighters, and it was a major victory. But the journalists were furious. In my view, the journalists really had themselves to blame. And I think this is a lesson here, and that is that US journalists need to watch what Israeli reporters are tracking. This is a serious gap. American reporters seem to have their own agenda, and more often than not, it addresses the Palestinian nationalist agenda, and it doesn't actually reflect facts on the ground. In my view, foreign reporters really need to be more cognizant of what local reporters in Israel are watching. Failure to do so comes at great risk. And I think they now probably realize that on some level, but I do just need to say here that the Israeli journalists that track these conflicts are excellent at what they do. Now, not everybody has the Hebrew language skills to be able to watch and to learn what they're saying, but all of these people speak English. All of these people, I think, are part of a journalistic community that would be eager to work with foreign correspondents that are placed over there. My sense is that the foreign correspondents are not speaking to them enough. You can just imagine what it would be like if there were pool reporters that were not being consulted by foreign journalists who thought they had a scoop about Joe Biden, or before that, Donald Trump. You just don't move ahead without getting a sense of a kind of a gut check about what local reporters are seeing. The idea that you can scoop them, I think, really does not resonate. The other thing that maybe we can say about what happened during that war was that for Israel, it's better to win than to be loved by the media. One can be repaired, and the other one is about survival at the end of the day. I'll just give one more anecdote from the war, and then I'll end because I see my time starting to run out. But I'll fast forward to May 19th of 2021. And for roughly 9 days, Joe Biden appeared to have Israel's back. He didn't waver. Not when Israel took out the metro system, not when it accidentally struck civilians, which happens, of course, in any war. He defended Israel at the United Nations, and he openly stated that Israel had a right to defend itself. And then on May 19th, the White House leaked a story to reporters that Biden was getting tough on Israel. He reportedly told them that then Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was done kidding around. It looked like things had grown tense. I am not sure they were. On May 18th, the day before, it was announced that Egypt had brokered a ceasefire. It was going to take effect in 2 days. Biden, at that point, had an opportunity to talk tough with the certain knowledge that Israel had completed its war. It had struck all of its intended targets. And it really did appear that the cadence of the war was beginning to diminish. And so Biden began to message, in my view, to the hard left of his party. These, of course, are the small gaggle of members who want to defund Israel or to deprive it of weapons. Some people call them the Squad. I would call them the Hamas caucus. They are a small but vociferous element of the Democratic Party, and Biden placated them. It looked like things were tense, but I don't believe they were. I believe that those last 2 days were really for domestic consumption only. And I think the final lesson here is that despite some of the odd optics, US-Israel ties were actually rather good during the war. I think that was not fully understood. And I think the White House, for some reason or another, wanted to message it that way. I think that it was better than it appeared, but I do find it extremely troubling that there is a consistent effort. We see it ongoing to this day on the part of pragmatists or mainstreamers within the Democratic Party, that folks are still trying to placate the loudest and most radical voices and those that would seek to undermine what I would describe as the most important relationship the United States has in the Middle East. There are, of course, other lessons that I could point to from the war. I give quite a number of them in my new book, which I certainly encourage everyone to purchase. It's available right now on Kindle. It will be available for purchase at Amazon and a number of other online booksellers starting on November 3rd, but pre-order is available now. So I thank everyone for the opportunity to chat today, and I'm certainly very eager to engage in a conversation. So again, to the Middle East Forum, thank you very much for having me.
Of course, it is our pleasure. Thank you so much. We have so many questions coming in. The first one from Jay Lewis. Is it realistic to think that the American and Western news media will ever lose its bias against Israel?
Look, I think that it's a tough question to answer. I think that it has been biased for quite some time, and certainly during the most recent rounds of conflict, that the bias was just incredibly clear. This war, to me, it was a wake-up call. It was a true slap in the face, as opposed to maybe instances of bias. This conflict really appeared to be consistent in that bias. The thing that I felt was important was to get this book out sooner rather than later, to begin to set the edge for the discussion. Whether or not the media heeds some of the lessons that I provide here, I can't tell you, but I do believe that there are a couple of things that are worth pointing out. One is the influence of Iran. It's pervasive. Somehow the media has forgotten that it was Hamas that almost single-handedly destroyed the peace process in the 1990s. It was their campaign of suicide bombings that ultimately derailed every step of progress that was made. And you could take issue with whether the two-state solution was a good thing or a bad thing back then, but we can say for sure that Hamas was the one that destroyed it, and that it did so with the help of Iran. Whether it was weapons training, whether it was military training, whether it was direct cash, all of these things, right, that we know that Iran provided, both are getting a free pass, Hamas and Iran, in the consistent coverage of these conflicts. Also, I think it's worth noting that Israel did, of course, leave the Gaza Strip in 2005 in an effort to try to decouple from the Gaza Strip and to give the Palestinians every opportunity to turn that territory into something that would be independent or somewhat independent. And what we see now is the fact that Hamas has driven this territory into the ground. As one senior Israeli official told me on my recent trip, that it is now a lost district of Israel and the Palestinian Authority. Nobody wants it. And that does, of course, raise tough questions about what Israel is supposed to do next when no one wishes to take control of a territory that is as lawless as the one that we now see in Gaza.
Speaking of the 1990s, an anonymous attendee asked, during the Oslo process, Gazans visited Israel and Israelis even visited Gaza, and Hamas was supported only 25% by the Gazan Palestinians. A two-state solution was envisioned by the end of the century. What would it look like what would it take to get back to the promising state of affairs? An Israeli reoccupation of Gaza or new leadership in all camps?
Well, it's actually fun. The beginning of the book, I noted my own visit to the Gaza Strip in 1998. In fact, there's a somewhat embarrassing picture of me at the end in my bio where it shows me at the age of 28 with dark hair and probably a good bit thinner, standing at the sign that says "Welcome to Gaza." There were a number of people that really took advantage of it, and in fact, Gaza-Israel relations in the really probably more mid 1990s was actually not bad. You hear all kinds of stories about Israelis going there and shopping and getting haircuts and getting dentist appointments and all sorts of things. And now, of course, I mean, by the time I went, it was already too dangerous to spend significant time there. And then, of course, after 2000, it just all, it was all downhill. I would just make the assertion here that a two-state solution still seems very far off. It barely seems like, I mean, it's not dead, but it certainly has been on life support for quite some time, really dating back to the Second Intifada from 2000 to 2005. I do think, however, that with the looming departure of Mahmoud Abbas, of course, nobody knows exactly when the Palestinian president will leave the scene, but he's in his 80s and he's not in terrific health. And there is the possibility that with a new leader, a compelling leader on the West Bank side, there could be an appetite to somehow reunify the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Right now, it seems just impossible because you've got Hamas on the one side, absolutely, steadfastly opposed to peace. And on the other side, you've got a weak leader who's got really nothing to say about the future of his own people. If there's somebody that can emerge, that inspires people on both sides of the Palestinian divide, in both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, that's where I think we could start to have some interesting new developments. But, until then, I think it really feels like it's dead in the water.
Thank you so much. From Carrie Hillebrand, does Israel have a more definitive solution than periodically mowing the grass?
Not right now, unfortunately, from Israel's perspective. And I think it's worth noting also, in terms of what the media missed. Israel doesn't want these conflicts. Israel actually absorbs rocket attacks on a regular basis, or they absorb these balloons with, explosives attached to them. They absorb the rushes to the fence and the attempts by children as well as militants to try to breach the fence. It's an ongoing problem. The Israelis would just much rather have quiet. They don't get it. And then there are moments where Israel decides that it must respond. Those moments typically include attacks on Israel's center, as it's known, the area surrounding Tel Aviv, that coastal plain area. If it comes under sustained fire, the Israelis respond. If Jerusalem comes under fire, the Israelis respond. That's, of course, Israel's capital, and they do not allow for anyone to breach that airspace. So, and that's what happened in this most recent conflict. Hamas fired its first number of salvos at Jerusalem, and that was, for me, that was the foregone conclusion. You knew that there was going to be a war that was going to take place. But in general, Israel will absorb a lot of strikes. They are always and this is, I think, also something that's not really appreciated. Israel does absorb these. It doesn't want the conflict, but it is constantly adding new legal targets to its target bank, as it calls it. That as it watches Hamas build up for the next conflict, whether it's tunnels, whether it's rocket launchers, drones, underwater drones, air drones, all of these things become active targets for the Israelis. They don't take out every threat as it materializes. They wait and they wait more and they wait more. And then finally they unleash, usually all at once, so as to try to keep things as quiet as possible. That, I think, is the best you can probably ask for right now until, a Nelson Mandela emerges from within the Hamas movement. The likelihood of that is extremely low. You have different centers of gravity inside the Hamas movement. You've got military and the quasi-political class. You've got West Bank, Gaza, as well as external actors that are based in Iran or Qatar or Turkey. Each one of these factions have something to say about the future of conflict with Israel, and most of them are not shying away. Most of them are advocating for yet another round, not in the expectation of winning, by the way, but an expectation of trying or doing as much damage as they possibly can to Israel but knowing at the end of the day that it is not likely they're going to emerge victorious. In fact, I think most of them understand that there's a less than 1% chance of victory, but they'll still do it anyway. And that's why Israel continues to try to hold off when it can. But mowing the lawn is unfortunately, I think, still a fact. It'll be a reality for some time to come.
Understood. Thank you. Isaac Cohen asks, was it a failure of the Israeli intelligence to let Iran sending thousands of rockets to Hamas and to ensure the know-how to build rockets and even sophisticated ones in this last round?
It's interesting. I've been tracking the Iranian activity and its support for Hamas over the years. The 2014, the last round of conflict erupted when Israel discovered that there were Fajr 5 rockets that were being smuggled by way of Sudan into the Gaza Strip, and the Israelis took out those rockets before the war began. Then they waited for an American election, and then they went to war. And this time around, I don't believe that there were a whole lot of full rockets that had been smuggled in. We saw some variants that were in the hands of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad that appeared to be full variants created and sent by Iran. But by and large, what we saw coming out of Hamas represented local know-how. So in other words, what's actually happened over time as the Israelis have gotten better at interdicting the smuggled rockets is that you have parts coming in, and then Iran is helping to teach the rocket engineers how to assemble them over time. And that, of course, makes it a lot harder for the Israelis. They're not able to see the large cargo coming through either by land or by sea. It makes it hard to interdict. The thing that I will just note here, and this is just a word of caution, and I believe I have talked about this for the Middle East Forum, I think last year, this is the question of PGMs, precision-guided munitions. The idea that somehow Hamas may be able to start smuggling in weapons that are much more precise and can hit strategic targets in Israel and potentially do grave damage. And so with the know-how that we continue to see with those that have been trained, that come back to Gaza, they're trained by the Iranians, they may get better training for the next round. And really the assumption has been, and I think it's borne out every conflict, is that Hamas is able to assemble or fire more sophisticated rockets each time, larger payloads. They can fire deeper into Israel. And again, the fear will now be more precise as well. So we're fearful for the next round, as always. I certainly don't envy the Israeli war planners, not in the north and certainly not in the south either.
And I suppose this might be our final question, but anonymous attendee wraps this up so perfectly. So Israel gives Hamas another black eye militarily, but the international press and media lambast Israel as the region's bully. We get the facts and understand the causation of the war, but our voice has been drowned out. Now what?
Well, I think the key here, and I would agree with that assessment. I think the key here is to begin to address these issues in between wars. What the Israelis are doing right now is they're waging what they call, I mentioned this earlier, their war between wars. They're waging a battle against Iran militarily, right? So they're taking out weapons that are finding their way from Iran through Iraq, through Syria to Lebanon, and Israel is bombing them. Israel is taking out assets of the Iranian nuclear program by cyber means or kinetic means, and the battle continues, right, on the high seas as well. We've seen a number of vessels destroyed, purportedly at the hands of the Israelis. So in other words, what they're doing is they're trying to weaken Iran in anticipation of the next conflict. I truly believe that if Israel was doing its job, and we can have a longer discussion about whether Israel does a good job at this, but it needs to begin to address a lot of the points that I raise in my book and the flawed narrative that we saw in the media. It needs to be addressed sooner. It needs to be addressed on a regular basis. If in fact it is an American interest to try to keep the Middle East on a lower flame or with no flame at all, we need to begin to look, I think, a lot closer at what's happening inside the Gaza Strip, the attempt by Iran to exploit Hamas and to wield it as a means to keeping the Middle East on that low to medium sized flame. I think that there is a really significant amount of explanation that needs to be made now, not when the next conflict arises, but to prepare journalists for what I think is to come and to prepare the American public for what is to come. Because as I noted, unfortunately, each round is going to be more difficult than the previous one. Round 5 is unfortunately coming. We don't know when. Sometimes it takes a year or two, sometimes it takes 7, but no matter what, each time it's a tougher fight.
Thank you. And before we go, can you just remind our viewers where we can find your book?
Absolutely. Never thought you'd ask. You'll find it on Amazon.com. It's actually produced by FTD Press. It's our it's our inaugural book through FTD, but we produced it through Amazon services. So it's called Gaza Conflict 2021, Hamas, Israel, and 11 Days of War. And it is available now on Kindle, and it's available for pre-order in the Dead Tree version, and it will be out within about a week.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We've come to the close of our webinar. Thank you again, Dr. Schanzer, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. For our viewers, please join us Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern for Israel Insider, a webinar with Ashley Perry. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a great day. And I'd also like to promote the book. I've read the first few chapters, and it's fantastic. Have a good one.